Welcome to Collision Podcasts, where art, history, and music collide. I am your host, Sharon Fitzgerald, and we are coming to you live from Los Angeles. Welcome to episode 2. This is the birth of modern art. This is the first in a series, and I am joined in studio with Harry Mattull, an incredible artist here in Los Angeles and oil painter. Harry, why don't you say hello?
Yeah, hi there, Sharon. Yes, it was so much fun getting together with you and the group at the Norton Simon Museum recently, and I'm excited today to jump into this topic of the beginning of modern art.
So when I first spoke with Harry at the Norton Simon Museum, I thought how he approached art history and thought about art, I just thought it was so compelling. And I thought, in fact, I asked him, I said, will you come on my podcast and will you help me introduce modern art? And all of a sudden, we've been talking about this for 3 weeks now, and it just becomes so overwhelming. It's just such a gigantic topic. You can go down rabbit holes one after another trying to qualify and quantify and describe modern art. And I think how we're going to approach this is we're going to call this the birth of modern art. This is episode 2 in the podcast, and this is the first part of the series. And we are not going to try to tackle every single artist and every single movement that we call modern art. But what we are going to try to do is sufficiently introduce what is modern art. Of course, at any given time when artists were painting, they'll look at their work and consider it modern. So what is it that we look back at a certain particular time and a particular place with a certain amount of artists and we qualify them as modern art? What made that art modern? And what was going on? When and where did this take place? And I think once we put this into a context, we'll begin to kind of create the environment. So, Harry, why don't you give me maybe some input on, we've been talking at great length about France in the 1860s, and just let us know, what were we walking into?
Well, I think it was such a fascinating time in history. We had social upheaval going on in France and an established art movement that was centered on the French Academy with annual salons that basically chose the approved art that was purchased either by the state, the French government, for museums and other institutions, or for aristocrats and other wealthy members of society to decorate their beautiful homes. And that was a system that became well entrenched, but didn't allow for more radical elements.
I think the radical elements that artists were yearning for, I think, is a reflection or maybe a product of the very turbulent past in France. It hadn't been even 100 years since the French Revolution, and in that time period we see the Napoleonic era and then a Bourbon Restoration in 1815, a restoration of the monarchy again, and then to only see another revolution in 1848. And I think that after the 1848 revolution, I think painters began to really call into question the validity of the Romantic movement. I think it seemed the emotionalism and the heroism and subject matter just started to feel kind of irrelevant.
The established art of the period had been too focused on the past. There was too much emphasis on history painting, subjects like ancient Rome, mythology, references to literature. These grand themes that focus too much on the past, too much on reinforcing the status quo. And artists who were trying to break away from this system saw that what was happening with the rapid changes in in life and society and history. It wasn't being addressed, and there was this emphasis, especially by writers and especially the French poet Baudelaire, who was trying to create a new modern art form and was calling out for artists to address this issue of modernity, addressing these issues of science and technology and social equality. And so part of the process of painting out of doors allowed artists to connect with the real world, to actually visibly see people at work, to see the new development of modernization in the cities, especially the renovation of Paris, to capture the essence of movement reflected by the speed of the trains. And also, photography was very important because it suddenly you could capture objective reality that could not be argued with, and therefore artists had to come to grips with that and try to create an alternative, compelling idea of art in light of this new way of depicting reality. So artists were grappling with that, but also using the new technology.
And in addition, there was also commercial innovations in the art world taking hold. And that is, one was the French box easel, which was invented to be able to easily transport a canvas to any location and be able to paint. And the second, and even more impressive, was the acrylic paint now available in tubes. So, this wasn't the Renaissance anymore. They could actually grab an easel, grab their canvas and their paint tubes, and very easily set up anywhere outdoors and paint for the first time. When we first think of modern art, we tend to think of an Impressionism. And although I would say that Impressionism was without a doubt the first artistic movement in modern art, I think we have to also just pause and give a nod to the French Realists. The French Realists are the first ones that come to the plate with challenging, not necessarily with the painterly quality and an impressionistic brushstroke, but they come to the table with challenging subject matter. And with that, I will quickly just name three artists that come to mind, and that would be Gustave Courbet, Daumier, and Millet. And each one of them were showing, like with Millet's The Gleaners, showing peasant life with a new sense of realism. And that is on the heels of a very turbulent France. So when you look at the art market, this wasn't a modern, middle-class art market. This was aristocracy. And when all of a sudden you're presenting paintings like Courbet's Stonebreakers or Millet's The Gleaners, you'd have to almost just feel how awkward and uncomfortable that would have been. And all of a sudden, that subject matter, they weren't completely heroic. These weren't... that we're not talking about idealized peasants, but Millet's like Man with the Hoe and The Gleaners. I mean, this is real deal. And Daumier, who was a newspaper illustrator, he did the famous Third Class Carriage, not showing wealthy aristocrats in the middle of the train enjoying themselves, but the Third Class Carriage, which was reserved for the lower classes. And again, very different subject matter and really challenging. And so I always like to mention, and I think that you have a lot to say on the subject as well, But you can't quite jump into modern art without giving a nod to these artists.
Yeah, they were so controversial in their time. Artists were, again, trying to capture this sense of modernity. And the government and the salon painters, the academic painters, were trying to hold on to the past, trying to idealize the human form, not reflect the harsh reality of people's actual lives, of actual changes in society, things like the renovation, the remodeling of Paris, forcing the peasants out of their suburbs to make way for new neighborhoods for the bourgeois class. And it's so interesting to see these common people, these non-heroic characters, these less than ideal images portrayed on a heroic scale on these large format canvases, which were reserved only for the most glorifying images of history, of past battle victories, kings and heroes and mythological stories. All of that was suddenly considered irrelevant for the modern painter. Courbet was the father of that whole concept. And you see that in his Burial of Ornan, where it's such a huge canvas that shocked audiences when they saw it. He also captured the reality of people at a burial where they may not even be focused on the actual scene, where they may be distracted. He was dealing with all sorts of issues of real life.
And he had the kind of like the audacity to make it 11 feet long. He actually sized it as a history painting, which was, it just aided. And they were like, you can't paint this that big. These people aren't famous. They're not wealthy. They're not aristocracy. They're not beautiful. The horizon line's in the wrong place. I mean, it was a bunch of unattractive people at a burial that shouldn't have been really captured, let alone painted 11 feet long.
You know, one of the things that I find interesting and just one of these amazing contradictions of real life is you have some of these game-changing painters like Courbet who are portraying the downtrodden, the social inequities. And yet he himself was the son of a wealthy man and had the luxury to indulge his passion for painting and could actually create his own pavilion to host his own exhibit. He wasn't motivated by having to sell his paintings, so he could actually challenge the academic system and create an amazing painting. The Studio and His Artist is such an intricate painting that's actually an allegory. That's part of its full title. And he addresses all sorts of concepts about what constitutes a modern painting, including the model not as an idealized nude, but as an actual real woman with actual normal features. He depicts poor people. He depicts a landscape of his actual village where he grew up. political characters. He even has an image slightly disguised of Napoleon III, who's kind of in the guise of a poacher because he feels that Napoleon III usurped his authority as a president by becoming emperor. And so it's an intricate painting that has a lot that can be read into it. Yeah, it's challenging on many levels.
That brings us to the next milestone in the modern art movement, is the Salon of the Rejected. So the French Academy really decided who was going to exhibit in the annual Salon. Now, keep in mind, there wasn't a middle-class art market. There wasn't galleries. That kind of art market didn't exist yet. The French Salon really were the indicators of who was going to be commissioning and selling work for the next year. If you were rejected from the French Salon, that could, I would say maybe not end your career, but that was certainly going to be a problem. So in 1863, 2/3 of the works were rejected. That was such a massive amount of work turned back by artists that had been in the Salon many times. And Napoleon III decided that he would create an exhibition of the rejected paintings and give everyone a fair shot.
I think it was a political consolation to kind of appease this growing discord with this kind of conflict of the different classes, and it would just be an easy way for him to allow some expression of artists and their art without really impacting the system as it stood.
And now I think that we get into a kind of a transition, because now we're going to leave the conversation of the French realists, and now we firmly plant one foot into modern art here with our first artist that was, I think, probably the biggest fiasco of the Salon of the Rejected, and that is Édouard Manet.
As I mentioned before, the poet Baudelaire and other writers had been hoping for a new voice in terms of presenting the modern art of the age, and they were looking for a modern artist, and lo and behold, in 1863, Édouard Manet shows up on the scene. Again, he's another wealthy young man who has the luxury of basically challenging the academy system and flying the face of the Salon, and has his opportunity in the Salon of the Refusés, and presents his monumental work, Déjeuner sur l'herbe, Luncheon on the Grass, which ends up shocking Paris and the art world to such a degree that it changes the idea of art forever, and is basically considered the seminal piece of modern art by many art critics. It captures this idea of modernity with a lot of ambiguity, with a lot of confusion, shows people in non-idealized settings, and yet still referring to some conventions of Renaissance art, but turned on its head, and with some wit and Also with a style of painting that's much more confrontational because it doesn't adhere, again, to this academy system of very fine brushwork and very subtle coloring and subtle shadows. It's much more brash. It confronts this whole idea of the nude by not idealizing the nude woman, instead, in essence, presenting a naked woman. And we know that because her clothes are almost at her feet. She's not presented as some Venus or nymph, as was portrayed in earlier academic paintings by artists such as Bouguereau or Thomas Couture or Cabanel. It's interesting. Alexander Cabanel actually got the Prix de Rome, the grand prize at the 1863 Salon, and his painting about Venus was actually purchased by Napoleon III. And here you have Manet portraying a woman who's clearly a modern woman in a forest park in Paris, sitting naked with two dressed male friends, looking back at us, unashamed, unidealized. You can see the rolls in her stomach. You can see that she's just enjoying their company. And there's actually another woman in the painting bathing just behind them. And part of the radical nature of the painting is this idea of there not being clear distinctions of perspective, big areas of flatness. Part of this idea of modernity is by bringing in the influences of Japanese wood prints that Manet and other artists were infatuated with and used as compositional devices. So there's these radical ideas and ways of presenting art that change art forever, and we can say that work is more or less the first modern art.
And just to kind of name a few of these conventions, when you look at the coupling of the two men and the woman in the foreground, you would initially be reminded of a couple of works, and that would be Romaldi's Judgment of Paris from 1520 and Giorgione's Pastoral Concert of 1510. So you recognize this composition, but the woman is no longer this Venus, this idealized woman. All of a sudden, it's really uncomfortable. All of a sudden, you see men in contemporary French clothing. They're dressed up like students. And the woman, correct me if I'm wrong, but we know her name, don't we?
Yes. The woman is Victorine Marent, who was Manet's favorite model for most of his early paintings.
And she's looking right at you. It's extremely confrontational. So that's kind of what we were talking about, where you take these Renaissance convention in terms of composition, in terms of the coupling, and it's just turned on its ear. And although, and of course, all of these works that we're referring to will be available in the show notes, which will be on collisionpodcast.com. And this was outrageous. This wasn't just a few critics having a jab. This was as if he had put out pornography in this Salon of the Rejected. And then also, I think this is a good time to talk about his next fiasco, which he did not present in the Salon of the Refused of 1863, but he did have in the Salon, it did get accepted in 1865, and that is his next work called Olympia. And talk about convention being turned on its ear. He takes what is basically Titian's Venus of Urbino. I would say arguably that would be the model for this work, the picture that he's really trying to utilize. And all of a sudden, our Venus is a modern-day French prostitute. No mistaking it. And what I love about this painting, even more than the controversial way that he contemporized the painting, but also I love the fact that, as you mentioned, the influence of Japanese woodcut works is really seen in this. Olympia is flat washed, not a lot of molding and shading. This is no longer the Renaissance. There is a flatness and a kind of a bird's eye view and a completely different way of painting. This is extraordinary if you look at it. And it just really, finalizes that we're done with the Renaissance and idealized Venuses, and all of that is over. And we've really stepped into a new ball game.
Yeah, in the Salon of 1865, Manet actually again hits a home run with Olympia, another very scandalous, extremely modern work, which challenges ideas of idealized beauty. But it's just so interesting how controversial it was. People were outraged when they saw it. Some of them would actually walk by and hit it with their umbrellas. At some point, they had to put the painting way up high on the ceiling so that it would be less offensive to the salon goers. But again, he's painting Victorine Morent as a courtesan, but there's an ambiguity by the fact that she's looking at us. She's implicating us in some kind of drama that's unfolding, that forces us to not just be simply a voyeur of idealized, virginal, beautiful women like you might see in a Bouguereau painting. Manet also brings his wit into it by having a black cat with an arched back, commenting on the sexual power of women. He has her semi-dressed, which again reflects this image of a courtesan. She's dangling one mule on her foot. She's wearing a camellia in her hair, which symbolized, again, this idea of the courtesan. She has an African French maid bring her flowers, probably from her suitor. So it creates this whole uncomfortable spectacle that forced French audiences to look at this spectacle of prostitution in modern day France, the reality of that.
I also feel like the way that this composition, I feel like we are the gentleman caller. We are in the room with her, and we are the ones soliciting her in a way. The viewer is actually part of the painting. We are the gentleman caller, which is very confrontational, and it's uncomfortable. Manet has a way of taking these very traditional conventions. Again, this is modeled after Titian's Venus of Urbino. When Titian did his, I mean, she was a courtesan too. But the way that Titian does his Venus, it's very idealized and acceptable, and it all looks very beautiful. This is the exact same subject, but all of a sudden we feel like we're participating in this, and she's looking dead on with that confrontational view. Not that the Venus of Urbino doesn't look at you, she does. But for some reason, Manet will just turn that on its ear. And the way that he makes this conventional, Renaissance, idealized Venus, all of a sudden she is contemporary. And when it's brought into the contemporary world, it's confrontational and uncomfortable, all wrapped up into one.
Looking at it compositionally, Olympia, again, has this wonderful Japanese sensibility of there not being a clear sense of depth, there being a very uniform flatness to it, which emphasizes the artifice of art and the fact that it shouldn't be some illusion to trick us into some idea of reality, that art in and of itself is an alternative kind of reality that we have to accept on its own terms. He uses some of the conventions of Japanese prints, such as a heavy black outline of the figure, very flat coloring of Olympia, with not much modeling. As a matter of fact, French critics criticized, saying she looked like a corpse, without a lot of shading, shadows. It's definitely an homage to his love of the Japanese art that was now part of French culture through the import of Japanese porcelain and other Japanese art forms that became more popular and were very modern and also emblematic of this idea of France as a colonial power with colonies in Asia and Africa. And all these issues were, again, contemporary and modern and were relevant now in 1865 France, in 1865 Paris, and there was no need to convey the same expression of art in some historical narrative.
And I believe that Émile Zola, the literary critic, he would take the opportunity to write in depth about Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, which was in the Salon of the Rejected of 1863. And then next, he will be a subject of the third painting by Manet that I think is really exceptional for totally different reasons. And that is the third painting of Manet that we'll talk about, which of course will be mentioned in the show notes below, is the portrait of Émile Zola. And as mentioned, Émile Zola was an art critic, and he wrote quite a bit about Manet and the Luncheon on the Grass. And this painting also has some other hidden treasures that we'll just kind of describe to you, and you can look in the show notes and check it out.
Yeah, this is such an interesting painting. In the background, you see references to some of the things that Manet was influenced by. For example, he has an interesting print of Diego Velázquez Bacchus with the barachos. He has a Japanese wood print He has also a print of Olympia. He's using the influences in his art and also making a witty comment on his own, trying to connect all these various influences to his art, and which is also a comment on Émile Zola, his support of the Impressionists, the independent painters, the modern painters. There was this mutual kind of love affair between these modern writers and these modern painters. And we constantly see the revelation of the influence of the Japanese in the modern painting. It kind of represented this challenge to the traditional academic painting that went all the way back to the Renaissance. Now you had this style of composition which challenged a perspective, which challenged modeling, which challenged narration, which looked at image making more in terms of just the pure joy of looking at paint on canvas, not creating an illusion of some kind of idealized reality, but a two-dimensional image that was beautiful in and of itself and could also have a modern component of reflecting actual people in a modern setting that reflected what was going on in society and commenting maybe on politics, and also which had a sense of humor.
I think it might be interesting to end with a quote on Manet from Professor Klaus. He is an art historian. He was actually the art historian in the White House for several presidents in the 70s and 80s, I think even maybe in the 60s. He wrote many of the art history books for the White House, and he is also a lecturer for the Great Courses series and an art historian at the Smithsonian. Professor Klaus is someone I have corresponded with. I think he is in his late 80s now, still living in Florida. If anyone gets a chance to see him lecture, he's incredible, like a mentor to me. And I want to just end with this quote of his impression, pardon the pun, on Manet. Quote, "It is not an exaggeration to say that modern art begins with Manet. It's a claim that can be made because of his vivid, painterly technique, his high-toned palette, and because of his often enigmatic personal subject matter, not drawn from the range of subjects treated by and sanctioned by previous generations. The world of historic subjects drawn from the Bible, mythology, and so on. But at the same time, we must not forget that his flashing brushwork owes its very being to his close observation of the painting of Velázquez in the Prado and the portraits of Franz Hall. Absorbing all of this, and he had appropriated composition and content ideas from the Renaissance, he combined them with his knowledge of Paris, the Parisian world, and he painted with a greater complexity and weight than any of his contemporaries." That was a quote by Professor Klaus with the Smithsonian on Manet. And I don't know about you, Harry, but I think we might be done. We were going to roll right into Monet.
Yeah, I think that was fun. Manet sets the stage for the rest of the 19th century and was the mentor of so many Impressionists. He always considered himself an independent, never actually exhibited with the Impressionists, but he set the tone, along with especially Courbet, with this idea of the modern, which was relevant in a turbulent age of technological, scientific, political, urban, revolutionary change. And I think this was a nice introduction into that part of history. It's going to be a lot of fun talking about Monet and the next evolution of modern art.
And with that, I want to thank my guest, Harry Mattull. Again, he's an incredible artist here in Los Angeles. And Harry, where can we find your artwork?
You can see my artwork at my Instagram page, at Harry Mattull. That has a nice cross-section of my paintings, from landscapes to portraits to imaginary scenes. I'm kind of, I don't want to even compare myself to these great masters, but I definitely paint whatever I feel like painting. I also have another Instagram page at Harry Mattull Art, which is more of a focus on my plein air landscapes and seascapes. I do like painting in an impressionistic style, but I certainly consider myself, just intellectually more independent, not necessarily serious. And for me, it's just more about enjoying nature, trying to capture a little bit of about it. Maybe more from the perspective of a caveman. So I'll leave the modern intellectual painting to the masters.
Thank you again, and Harry's Instagram account and all links, and I even would like to put a few of your paintings in the show notes if you don't mind. That they're amazing. I'd like to thank him so much for being my guest here. And if I can talk him into part 2, I think the modern art, the birth of modern art, is going to turn into a series, and it will really evolve on its own. And I think that Monet, he doesn't deserve to be at the tail end of a podcast. So thank you again to Harry Mattull. Everything will be in the show notes below. And thank you. This was episode 2 of Collision Podcast, where art, history, and music collide. I am your host, Sharon Fitzgerald, and thank you so much for listening.